The Sleuth of Letters, Anne Radcliffe, Agatha Christie, and Detection as Reading. You may recall the Doctor Who episode in which a portrayal of Agatha Christie is complimented on her writing. She then confides, "Try as I might, it's hardly great literature. Now that's beyond me. I'm afraid my books will be forgotten, like ephemera." Although the Doctor owns a copy of Death in the Clouds, published in the year 5 billion, and he explains that people never stop reading Christie's novels. This claim that her books are not literary goes unchallenged. The idea that authors can either be popular or literary, but not both, heavily informs real-world critical reception. It has inhibited an academic appreciation for Agatha Christie while also minimizing the legacy and contemporary relevance of her main forerunners, among them the tremendously popular proto-mystery author Anne Radcliffe. The impact these women had on literary history is undeniable. Radcliffe's novels established a recognizable sensibility for Gothic fiction, while the many similarly titled books that followed in the wake of her works, contributed to the formation of a sense of literary genre. Likewise, Agatha Christie contributed to the advent of paperbacks. The Penguin Book founder, Alan Lane, had the idea to publish cheap and portable novels on his way home from a visit with the young crime writer. She was one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century, and her books have been translated into over 100 languages. Some even claim that Christie has been outsold only by William Shakespeare and the Bible. In spite of these profound accomplishments, the literary afterlives of Radcliffe and Christie display scholarly neglect. No definitive sales record exists for Christie's books, nor does publication data, or even a definitive list of her entire works. Meanwhile, Radcliffe is almost exclusively read in academic settings, and is an author whose importance lies decidedly in the past. If, however, these great novelists were viewed as points on the same continuum, Radcliffe could provide Christie with literary roots, and gain for herself a recognition of her place in modern culture. In order to portray Agatha Christie not as the queen of a modern phenomenon, but rather as the modernizer of a timeless tradition, I connect her novels to Anne Radcliffe's through their shared concern with interrelations between literary and worldly investigations. While many regard detective fiction as something originating, fully formed, in the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, the processes, techniques, concerns, and interests of literary detectives trace back to antiquity. If we think about it, a detective is someone who learns of past events, or studies the human condition, or forecasts probable futures, based on their observations and interpretations. Investigation, therefore, depends on aspirations and procedures, which are analogous with those of reading. I approach the detective tradition by tracing this interest in reading as it manifests in the complex rules of literary engagement that both Radcliffe and Christie explore. That is to say that the interest in readerly experience and participation becomes a cornerstone of the detective genre, as it is developed and sophisticated by my chosen authors. The interactive imperative both occasions and reflects the use of devices such as red herrings and metonymic clues, which presuppose active engagement with the text. Coming from the point of view generated by reader-oriented literary criticism, it is clear that Christie's detective fiction is not a distraction from literary tradition. Rather, the modes of observation she fashions mimic the sublime, kitschy, and reconstructive experiences of likewise observant readers. While literary critics and historians of Anne Radcliffe argue to what extent her novels qualify as Gothic, few even consider her claim as a mystery author. Sometimes, however, scholars attempting to trace back the lineage of detective fiction mention Radcliffe in passing. She could not, according to a view voiced by Charles Rebska, be considered a detective novelist, because she does not fully provide readers with the means by which to solve the mysteries ahead of the characters. According to other critics, Radcliffe did not write detective stories because detective fiction must feature a professional and recognizable detective character, and she, working in the late 18th century, had no concept of private investigators. Yet, even if Radcliffe does not fit within such parameters for the detective genre, she remains an obvious progenitor of the entire detective tradition. Working within the Gothic mode, which is necessarily concerned with discovering and reconstructing past wrongs, Radcliffe pioneered a strand of cosily crime-ridden novels. Whereas her Gothic predecessors, such as Horace Walpole and Clara Reeves, wrote novels in which crimes are solved supernaturally by ghosts and saints, Radcliffe penned mysteries that, although bizarre, are nevertheless caused and solved exclusively through human means. As a literary-minded author, interested both in readerly engagement and in the rationalizations of absurdly ridiculous plot points, Radcliffe prefigures Agatha Christie. Christie was always willing to challenge the expectations both of her readers and her critics, and, consequently, she was frequently accused of breaking the rules of fair play, designed to allow readers to solve the crimes ahead of the detectives. The rules of fair play, in all their various forms, attest to the ways in which detective fiction fundamentally concerns reader-writer contracts. If the reader is asked to maintain an active attention throughout the whole novel, then the author must, as the argument goes, be obligated to satisfy their efforts. Members of the Detection Club, a crime writers group of which Agatha Christie was president from 1957 to 1976, swore an oath never to make use of divine revelation, feminine intuition, mumbo-jumbo, jiggery-pokery, coincidence, or act of God. Agatha Christie played with the rules in numerous ways, particularly in her literalizations of the relationship between readers and writers. Christie fashioned for herself an alter ego fictional detective writer, Ariadne Oliver, who, whenever she varies from the standard rules of fair play, baffles Christie's detective, Hercule Poirot. But Poirot always respects Oliver, and knows that, when he finally works out her meaning, Ariadne Oliver is very frequently correct. Despite consistent accusations of foul play in Christie's own novels, the Queen of Crime always maintained that she treated her readers fairly. Still, despite its insistence on rational, logical plot progression, the detective story carries forward from the Gothic fiction that preceded and enabled it, a central involvement with irrationality. Detective stories cannot be rational. Instead, they must be rationalized. They must be confusing for most of their present, and logical only in their denouement's account of the past, so that readers cannot solve the puzzles too easily. The grand reveal of a post facto rationale is, of course, one of the pillars of the detective genre. Far from being a new literary device that originated with a detective story, this rationalizing of seemingly absurd details has a long previous history under the term the explained supernatural. The Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe remains a key figure in this discourse because nearly every critic who has written on her novels has felt compelled to analyze her use of this move as a way to gauge her mastery, or lack thereof, of literary style. While a surprising and clever rationalization can neatly wrap up the story while reinforcing the author's sagacity, this literary move runs the risk of effecting the opposite. It is paramount that the readers accept your explanation. Otherwise, people may consider the device as a patch compensating for stylistic inadequacy, and spend 224 years mocking your pirate tunnels, as readers have done ever since Radcliffe resorted to hidden pirate tunnels as a plot device in her Mysteries of Udolpho. Radcliffe's pirate tunnel scene begins with a haunted, uninhabited West Wing. A chateau has recently changed hands, and its new owner, the Count de Villefort, must dispel his servant's superstitious terrors before he can utilize the whole house. To this end, the servant Ludovico, who in previous episodes has engineered the heroine's escape from Castle Udolpho, agrees to stay up all night and watch the apartments and see if he can observe anything that might solve their mysteries. And it turns out that, guess what? The late Marchioness was poisoned in this same Gothic wing of the chateau. And it is the accidental investigation into the mysterious life, death, and relations of this Marchioness, which is the narrative line in Mysteries of Udolpho, that approaches nearest to a detective story. Radcliffe introduces this central mystery when her heroine, Emily, imagining a spectral presence in her late father's armchair, accidentally reads over a few lines of the papers of his she was tasked to burn. Although her systems of cluing readers into the mysteries remain less identifiable than in modern detective fiction, Radcliffe nevertheless signals to readers that the later haunted apartment event is a continuation of the same investigation, marked similarly with a spectre, an armchair, and a reader. At the haunted apartment, actually the novel's primary crime scene, Ludovico decides to spend the night reading, until, when startled, he sets aside his book, imagining he saw a man's face looking over the high back of his armchair. This is actually the last time readers hear of Ludovico, until he returns to the narrative 100 or so pages later, and explains that he was simply abducted by pirates. Let us pause for a moment to briefly examine Edgar Allan Poe's place in the conversation about detective fiction, and the ways his introduction of his paradigmatic master detective, Dupin, acknowledges the critical role that the concept of readers play in the foundation of the genre. In fact, Poe began his foray into detective stories not with gory fingerprints and smoking guns, but with books. As the narrator first describes Dupin, books indeed were his sole luxuries, and I was astonished at the vast extent of his reading. Poe introduces Dupin first as a reader and only later as one uncommonly good at deduction. Anticipating Dupin's armchair method used in the second story, Poe not only prioritizes the reading skill set, but establishes it as an introduction or even precursor of the detective skill set. The professionalism, epitomized by Sherlock Holmes, may have its importance, but Christie's novels illustrate how instantly recognizable classic Golden Age detective fiction can be written with a variety of very different detectives, or even without a detective at all. What unites Christie's array of novels is rather the centrality to them of modes of reading, readerly observation, and literary pastimes. Ultimately, reading and detection intersect for Christie and for her forerunners at the mediatory standpoint of the armchair. We have seen an armchair in a crime scene of Radcliffe's, and in the thesis from which this paper is drawn, I discuss relevant armchairs in early crime fiction by Walter Scott, which I'd be happy to discuss in the question and answers. With their material, conceptual, and symbolic dimensions, these stylish furnishings support the practices and practitioners, both of reading and detection. They pertain to jurisdiction by demarcating intellectual spaces, such as offices, studies, and libraries, while enthroning that space's authority. They could, conceptually at least, represent a visualization of contesting seats of power. Furthermore, the term armchair detective applies equally to fictional characters solving cases from their homes, and to readers solving the cases in anticipation of the story's denouement. As commodities symbolic of intellectual pursuits, armchairs enjoy close relationships to identity, and because of which they contribute to perceptions of intelligence in literary detectives. In her novel Cards on the Table, Christie depicts an all-around collector and connoisseur who decides to pioneer an appreciative rather than judgmental mode of murder detection. Still wanting to show off his cleverness, this connoisseur, Mr. Shaitana, invites 4 people he's almost certain committed murder, along with an audience, Poirot, Ariadne Oliver, and a police superintendent, to a denouement dinner party. As readers watch this train wreck unfold, it comes as little surprise that the host is stabbed to death in his armchair during the bridge game. In his status as celebrity detective, as someone whose interpretations are both considered law and widely circulated, Poirot frequently emerges as a literary critic, judgmental in just the right degree. While Poirot's sidekick, or so-called Watson character, Captain Hastings, represents the paranoid reader, constructive though perhaps too hasty in judgments, Shaitana's death reminds us that a connoisseur reader, void of all judgment, is either shamming or superfluous. Instead of facilitating detection, his armchair ensconces death. Christie often works with pairs of detectives, whether they be Tommy and Tuppence, Poirot and Hastings, Miss Marple and an assistant, or Poirot and Mrs. Oliver, in ways that illustrate conflicting yet ultimately complementary styles of detection or modes of reading. Although many people argue that assistant detectives, the so-called Watson characters, are less smart, less valuable, unneeded, or merely proxies for the actual readers, I beg to differ. In addition to their own contributions to cases, these characters allow their friends to discuss and read out loud the cases, acts which hold value not simply for the ease of narration, but also as an important step in the detection process. In providing her readers, as she often does, with two overlapping detectives, Christie reminds her readers that doubling remains an important aspect, not only of detective fiction, but also of reading itself. Just as detective fiction typically relies on a double narrative structure, telling both the story of the crime and the story of its investigation, so too does reading generally describe a form of double consciousness in which the reader exists. Many, dare I say most, reading experiences also feature the juxtaposition of conflicting layers of judgment that could be conceptualized as part of a double consciousness. Let us describe the first as a Hastings impulse, to connect the dots in the most obvious way, and then complain about the book's triviality, and the second as a conflicting Poirot impulse, positive that the plot is more sophisticated, if only one can find the proper vantage point from which to view the details. Radcliffe, for her part, explores readerly doubling and critical vantages with a timeless shipwreck device in Mysteries of Udolpho. She introduces new, yet identical characters, pursuing a new, yet strangely similar path, until readers watch the recently introduced Blanche as she watches Emily experience a shipwreck. By connecting separate narrative threads with this transportative failure, Radcliffe evokes a long tradition of philosophical thought experiments that discuss the pleasure one feels when, from high ground, one watches someone else struggling in the sea. Rather than denoting a form of schadenfreude, the shipwreck illustrates the benefits of the solid grounding that philosophy affords the spectator. Deeply interested in the relationships between literature and philosophy, Radcliffe here reminds us that the act of reading allows one to watch countless shipwrecks, train wrecks, and crimes, distilling their sublimity by experiencing them without bodily threat. In the Christie novel Cards on the Table that I introduced earlier, Ariadne Oliver, the friend of Poirot's who I've suggested is a stand-in for Christie herself, converses with a murder suspect's roommate over tea. The teenage girl, who is both the reader and fan of Oliver's novels, remarks, "It's odd, isn't it? How the same things happen, again and again to people. I had an aunt who was always in shipwrecks, and here's Anne, mixed up in 2 sudden deaths." Could witnessing fictional death in the modern mystery novel represent the modernization of the classic topos of spectating imagined shipwrecks? Christie's invocation of shipwreck certainly seems to support this reading. By explaining the shipwreck experiencer as the antecedent of this literary-minded girl enveloped in criminal plots, Christie seems to gesture back to Emily St. Aubert and her line of seafaring unfortunates. Over the course of this talk, a theme has emerged about things that happen over and over. To shipwrecks and to murders, I would add the whole modes of storytelling that merely rework ideas and narratives explored by Radcliffe and Christie. Instead of sinking into the sea of time, the works of Radcliffe and Christie remain forever visible on the horizon of cultural spectatorship. Perhaps it's time we viewed them with critical lenses that better bring their literary relevance into focus.